The descent into the lore of the Arkley Mountains and the disaster of the Ecliptic Express introduces the narrative of the genesis of the bioorganic catastrophe. Set 24 hours before the infamous mansion incident, the world of survival horror begins not with a viral leak, but with a calculated act of vengeance, representing the architectural sabotage of the Umbrella Corporation. The lore suggests that the forest is a labyrinth of the infected, where the STARS Bravo team is sent to die as data points. For the young medic Rebecca Chambers, this history is the lore of the loss of the institutional innocence. She enters the woods expecting a rescue mission, but finds a graveyard on rails. This is the lore of the industrialized death, where the company has turned the commute into a sacrament of the infection. It proves that the Umbrella's ambition was never medicine, but the standardization of the monster, turning the train into a mobile laboratory of the damned. The encounter with Billy Coen provides the lore of the moral duality of the outcast. Billy, a former Marine lieutenant sentenced to death for a massacre he didn't commit, represents the sovereignty of the wrongly accused. His lore is defined by the burden of the military honor. He is a man of war, forced into a war of the shadows, representing the dissonance of the justice. This is the lore of the unlikely covenant. It suggests that survival requires the suspension of the judgment. This represents the tactical sovereignty of the partnership. The lore of the handcuffs is the lore of the shattered chain. Rebecca must choose to trust the criminal to defeat the corporate, proving that her sovereignty is intuitive. This highlights the humanizing nature of the crisis, turning the initial confrontation into a contract of the blood, where the soldier and the medic become the last guard of the truth. The arrival of the leech swarms and the mysterious singing man introduces the lore of the biological symphony of the progenitor. These parasitic organisms, capable of mimicking the human form, represent the fluidity of the viral intelligence. Their lore is defined by the sovereignty of the colony. They do not just kill, they replace, turning the victim into a vessel for the collective, representing the hive mind sovereignty of the Marcus. This is the lore of the rebirth of the founder. It suggests that death in the Umbrella world is a transformation rather than an end. This represents the necrotic sovereignty of the evolution. The lore of the Leech Man is the lore of the melting identity. When the passenger turns into a swarm, you realize that the individual is obsolete, proving that your sovereignty is the only shield against the biological ocean. This highlights the organic horror of the zero, turning the train cars into a sacrament of the consumption. The lore of the train's collision and the secret platform provides the lore of the mechanical veins of the Umbrella. As the Ecliptic Express is sabotaged and crashes into a hidden underground facility, it represents the deep infrastructure of the deception. The lore suggests that the forest is merely a skin over a skeleton of the steel and the concrete. This is the lore of the subterranean empire. It suggests that civilization has a secret basement where the laws of the nature are broken for the profit. This represents the architectural sovereignty of the Spencer. The lore of the crash site is the lore of the end of the transit. You are no longer moving through the world. You are entering the gut of the machine, proving that your sovereignty is claustrophobic. This highlights the inevitability of the discovery, turning the wreckage into a sacrament of the descent, where the hero must walk into the dark to find the source of the light. The encounter with Albert Wesker and William Birkin, observing from the shadows, introduces the lore of the Cold Watch of the Disciples. These two scientists, representing the next generation of the evil, view the train disaster as a pilot study, representing the analytical sovereignty of the sociopath. Their lore is defined by the observation of the agony. They do not intervene, they measure, turning the death of the Bravo team into a variable in the T-virus equation. This is the lore of the academic malice. It suggests that the greatest threat is not the zombie, but the clipboard. This represents the intellectual sovereignty of the conspiracy. The lore of the monitor room is the lore of the panopticon of the Arkley. It reminds the player that freedom is an illusion of the lab rat, proving that your sovereignty is observed. This highlights the cynical nature of the Umbrella, turning the journey into a sacrament of the experiment. The lore of the management training facility provides the lore of the pedagogy of the sociopathy. This ornate, cathedral-like school, built to train the Umbrella elite, represents the theological dedication to the power. The lore suggests that the company is a religion with its own saints and sins. This is the lore of the corporate priesthood. It suggests that leadership is engineered through the cruelty. This represents the institutional sovereignty of the Marcus. The lore of the main hall is the lore of the grandeur of the grave. You must solve statue puzzles and clockwork riddles to advance your rank, proving that your sovereignty is intellectual. This highlights the esoteric nature of the biohazard, turning the exploration into a sacrament of the initiation, where the hero becomes the unintended graduate of the hell. For the Rebecca of the train era, the world is the testing of the professional spine. You realize that the world is infected. The lore suggests that Rebecca is the cleanliness in the rot. You are the only hand that heals in a facility that breeds the disease. The train is not a vehicle, it is a moving coffin that you must exit with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the teaming with Billy so necessary. You are trading your badge for your life. You look at the leeches on the glass, knowing that they are the only success that the Umbrella has left to show the world. The golden age is a whistle of the steam, and you are the only note left to sing against the silence of the grave. As this first segment of the history concludes, the duo stands at the gates of the training facility, the train a burning wreck behind them. Behind lies the genesis of the catastrophe. Before stands the sanctuary of the Marcus and the mystery of the first viral leak. The air is no longer tense with the rain, but heavy with the smell of the chemicals. You have seen the calculated sabotage, the moral duality of the outcast, and the biological symphony of the progenitor. The lore of Resident Evil has shifted from the mystery of the woods to the anatomy of the corporate sin. You realize that the Umbrella is deep. You look at the statue of the founder, knowing that you are finally the witness of the origin. The Golden Age is a door opening into the dark, and you are the only lantern left to expose the heart of the Umbrella. The exploration of the Umbrella Management Training Facility and the revelation of the James Marcus legacy introduces the lore of the theological roots of the bioweaponry. This grand estate, designed with the aesthetics of a European cathedral, represents the arrogance of the intellectual divinity. The lore suggests that Dr. James Marcus, one of the three founders of Umbrella, viewed the T-virus not as a weapon, but as a new gospel for the human race. For Rebecca and Billy, the facility is the lore of the academic deception. They find that the school was a front for the culling of the weak, where students were groomed to value efficiency over the humanity. This is the lore of the corporate cultism, where the progenitor virus is the Holy Spirit of a new, dark religion. It proves that the Umbrella's foundations were built on a sacrament of the parasite, turning the training grounds into a temple of the transhumanist sin. The discovery of the progenitor virus and the mother virus archives provides the lore of the primordial source of the infection. Found deep within the facility's restricted zones, the progenitor represents the biological ancestry of the chaos. Its lore is defined by the sovereignty of the African sunflower. It suggests that the Umbrella didn't create the horror. They industrialized an ancient, natural power to overwrite the genetic code. This is the lore of the stolen fire. It suggests that sovereignty over the evolution was snatched from the nature to be bottled in the vials. This represents the technological sovereignty of the Spencer and Marcus. The lore of the progenitor is the lore of the original sin of the science. It proves that the T-virus is merely a watered-down version of a godlike fluid, turning the laboratory into a sacrament of the blasphemy, where the researchers became the gravediggers of the mankind. The encounter with the Centurion, the giant infected centipede, provides the lore of the arthropod expansion of the virus. This creature, which captures Rebecca in the facility's ballroom, represents the viral adaptability of the low-order life. Its lore is defined by the sovereignty of the exoskeleton. It suggests that the T-virus does not discriminate between the mammal and the insect, turning the smallest nuisance into a colossal predator, representing the entomological sovereignty of the Marcus. This is the lore of the accelerated metabolism. It suggests that size is a variable of the infection. This represents the biological sovereignty of the mutation. The lore of the centurion is the lore of the predator of the ballroom. Billy must slay the beast to save the partner, proving that his sovereignty is reliant. This highlights the interdependent nature of the survival, turning the boss fight into a sacrament of the trust, where the criminal proves his value to the law. The trial of the night statues and the microfilm puzzles introduces the lore of the medieval obsession of the umbrella. Throughout the facility, the use of armor and swords as keys represents the feudal sovereignty of the founders. The lore suggests that Marcus and Spencer saw themselves as modern kings, ruling over a serfdom of the ignorance. This is the lore of the aristocratic malice. It suggests that power is a puzzle that only the worthy can solve. This represents the intellectual sovereignty of the elite. The lore of the knight is the lore of the silent guard. You must align the weapons to open the paths, proving that your sovereignty is observant. This highlights the ritualistic nature of the facility, turning the puzzle solving into a sacrament of the progression, where the hero must think like the tyrant to escape the tyranny. The encounter with the proto-tyrant, T-001, the early-stage biological soldier, introduces the lore of the imperfect blueprint of the perfection. This creature, a precursor to the famous tyrant of the mansion, represents the experimental failure of the ambition. Its lore is defined by the sovereignty of the exposed heart. It suggests that power without refinement is vulnerable and raw, representing the surgical sovereignty of the umbrella. This is the lore of the developmental horror. It suggests that the umbrella was practicing the death on the failures before they mastered the kill. This represents the prototype sovereignty of the Birkin. The lore of the proto-tyrant is the lore of the grotesque ambition. It reminds the player that humanity is a resource to be sculpted, turning the morgue battle into a sacrament of the dehumanization, where the hero witnesses the draft of the apocalypse. The lore of the Marcus Wesker betrayal provides the lore of the predatory succession of the evil. Through the diaries found in the facility, it is revealed that Spencer ordered Wesker and Birkin to assassinate Marcus to steal his research, representing the corporate cannibalism of the sovereignty. The lore suggests that the umbrella is a pit of the vipers, where the mentors are eaten by the disciples. This is the lore of the treachery of the white coat. It suggests that loyalty is a chemical weakness. This represents the nihilistic sovereignty of the Wesker. The lore of the assassination is the lore of the rebirth of the ghost. It explains why the Leech Man is singing. It is the soul of the Marcus returning to drown the company in its own infection, proving that your sovereignty is caught in a crossfire of the dead. This highlights the vengeful nature of the story, turning the investigation into a sacrament of the retribution. For the Billy of the training era, the world is the testing of the moral redemption. You realize that the world is more corrupt than the prison. The lore suggests that Billy is the guilty man in the innocent world. You are the only hands that hold the gun for the right reasons in a building of the sins. The facility is not a school. It is a labyrinth of the lies that you must navigate with your very soul. This perspective is what makes the saving of Rebecca so heavy. You are becoming a hero while the law calls you a monster. You look at the umbrella crest, knowing that it is the only badge that the history has left to shadow the truth. The Golden Age is a shadow in the hallway, and you are the only will left to lead the medic through the den of the leeches. As this second segment of the history concludes, the duo stands at the entrance to the basement labs, the training hall echoing with the screams of the infected. Behind lies the theological roots of the weaponry. Before stands the industrial heart of the Arkley and the call of the resident evil. The air is no longer tense with the mystery, but cold with the reality of the torture. You have seen the James Marcus legacy, the discovery of the progenitor, and the trial of the centurion. The lore of Resident Evil has shifted from the genesis of the catastrophe to the sovereignty of the retribution. You realize that the ghost is real. You look at the darkness of the elevator, knowing that you are finally the witnesses of the fall. The golden age is a steel door closing, and you are the only hope left to stop the singing of the leeches. The descent into the underground laboratory and the infiltration of the Arkley Research Center introduces the lore of the industrialized sanitization of the horror. This facility, hidden beneath the ornate elegance of the training school, represents the functional sovereignty of the T-virus. The lore suggests that the Cathedral of Marcus was merely a mask for the factory of the Birkin. For Rebecca and Billy, the lab is the lore of the sterile nightmare. They find that the medical progress of Umbrella is the assembly line of the damned, where human subjects were reduced to materials and the scientists became the mechanics of the mutation. This is the lore of the chemical purgatory, where the sovereignty of the hero is tested by the sovereignty of the biohazard. It proves that the Umbrella's success was built on the mathematics of the agony, turning the operating table into a sacrament of the dehumanization. The encounter with the stalker in the steam, the recurring proto-tyrant, provides the lore of the relentless pursuit of the imperfect. This creature, stalking the narrow catwalks and steam-filled corridors, represents the unstoppable logic of the weapon. Its lore is defined by the sovereignty of the heartbeat. It suggests that once the bioweapon is activated, it has no moral off-switch, representing the kinetic sovereignty of the T-001. This is the lore of the developmental ghost. It suggests that the Umbrella cannot control what they create. This represents the unstable sovereignty of the genetic engineering. The lore of the catwalk battle is the lore of the narrowing path. You must defeat the prototype to earn the future, proving that your sovereignty is precise. This highlights the claustrophobic nature of the combat, turning the industrial wing into a sacrament of the grit, where the medic must face the giant to keep the heart beating. The first mutation of the Marcus, the Leech mimicry reveal, provides the lore of the biological resurrection of the Vengeance. When the young man in the white robes finally reveals his true form, he is not a human, but a colony of leeches that has digested the Marcus's memories, representing the fluidity of the identity. The lore suggests that Marcus is no longer a man, but a viral intelligence seeking to erase the Umbrella, representing the necrotic sovereignty of the Retribution. This is the lore of the parasitic ghost. It suggests that the virus has learned to hate. This represents the sentient sovereignty of the progenitor. The lore of the transformation is the lore of the end of the human face. You realize that the singing man is the incarnation of the infection, proving that your sovereignty is the only buffer against the tide of the leech. This highlights the supernatural nature of the biohazard, turning the library into a sacrament of the revelation. The lore of the steam puzzles and the chemical mixtures introduces the lore of the analytical survival of the STARS throughout the lab. The need to balance the gas pressures and mix the stripping agents represents the intellectual sovereignty of the Rebecca. The lore suggests that the world can only be saved through the precision of the science. This is the lore of the alchemical resistance. It suggests that knowledge is the only antidote to the chaos. This represents the scientific sovereignty of the medic. The lore of the mixing chamber is the lore of the molecular battle. You must choose the right element to dissolve the barrier, proving that your sovereignty is calculated. This highlights the methodical nature of the Zero, turning the item management into a sacrament of the order, where the hero must synthesize the victory from the chaos of the chemicals. The encounter with the Eliminators, the infected primates, introduces the lore of the simian cruelty of the research. These fast, aggressive monsters represent the primal ferocity of the viral enhancement. Their lore is defined by the sovereignty of the reflex. It suggests that the T-virus strips away the civilization to reveal the aggression of the ancestor, representing the evolutionary sovereignty of the Marcus. This is the lore of the bestial mirror. It suggests that the Umbrella sought to weaponize the instinct. This represents the predatory sovereignty of the animal kingdom. The lore of the Eliminator Room is the lore of the blur of the death. You must track the untrackable to stay alive, proving that your sovereignty is reactive. This highlights the frenetic nature of the horror, turning the corridor skirmish into a sacrament of the reflex, where the soldier must outfight the beast to protect the light. The lore of the waste disposal and the BOW incineration provides the lore of the disposable nature of the life. Finding the pit of the failures, where biological experiments are dumped like trash, represents the ethical bankruptcy of the sovereignty. The lore suggests that success for Umbrella is built on a mountain of the discarded. This is the lore of the industrialized grave. It suggests that the individual has no value in the eyes of the board. This represents the capitalist sovereignty of the Spencer. The lore of the incinerator is the lore of the smoke of the crimes. It reminds the player that evidence is burned to keep the stock price high, proving that your sovereignty is the only record of the truth. This highlights the cynical nature of the Umbrella, turning the descent into the pit into a sacrament of the witness, where the hero walks through the ash of the victims to expose the murderers. For the Rebecca of the lab era, the world is the testing of the clinical courage. You realize that the world is laboratory meat. The lore suggests that Rebecca is the logic in the madness. You are the only mind that categorizes the chaos to find the cure. The lab is not a building, it is a mechanical organism that you must deactivate with your very integrity. This perspective is what makes the solving of the chemicals so vital. You are treating the wound of the earth. You look at the incubator, knowing that it is the only cradle that the Umbrella has left to birth the future. The golden age is a click of the vial, and you are the only solution left to neutralize the poison of the Marcus. As this third segment of the history concludes, the duo stands at the entrance to the treatment plant, the lab vibrating with the imminent self-destruction. Behind lies the industrialized sanitization of the horror. Before stands the abyss of the waste and the final duel with the Leech Queen. The air is no longer tense with the chemicals, but cold with the smell of the sewage. You have seen the relentless pursuit, the first mutation of the Marcus, and the simian cruelty of the research. The lore of Resident Evil has shifted from the sovereignty of the retribution to the sovereignty of the survival. You realize that the plant is alive. You look at the rising steam, knowing that you are finally the final obstacle of the extinction. The golden age is a red light flashing, and you are the only hand left to stop the pulse of the biohazard. The descent into the waste treatment plant and the final navigation of the industrial bowels introduces the lore of the excretory truth of the Empire. This facility, where the chemical runoff and failed biological matter of the entire Arkley complex are processed, represents the ecological sovereignty of the rot. The lore suggests that the Umbrella is a body that does not digest its sins, but simply hides them in the deepest gut. For Rebecca and Billy, the plant is the lore of the industrialized decay. They walk through tunnels where the walls are slippery with the failed life, and the air is thick with the methane of the dead. This is the lore of the final filter of the humanity, where the sovereignty of the hero is tested by the sovereignty of the filth. It proves that the Umbrella's grandeur ends in a sacrament of the sludge, turning the sewage system into a catacomb of the corporate waste. The final duel with the proto-tyrant, T-001, provides the lore of the persistence of the faulty evolution. After surviving the laboratory, the creature returns one last time, representing the relentless nature of the flawed ambition. Its lore is defined by the sovereignty of the scar tissue. It suggests that the T-virus creates a will to kill that outlasts the stability of the form, representing the violent sovereignty of the prototype. This is the lore of the end of the experiment. Dante, or rather Billy, must deliver the final blow to the exposed heart, proving that his sovereignty is lethal. This highlights the tragic nature of the bioweapon, turning the industrial platform into a sacrament of the mercy, where the hero must extinguish the prototype to end the suffering of the machine. The encounter with the Queen Leech in its Marcus avatar introduces the lore of the metamorphosis of the vengeful memory. As the young Marcus explains how he spent 10 years reconstituting his consciousness through the leeches, it represents the sovereignty of the patient hatred. The lore suggests that the progenitor virus has a memory that can outlive the brain. This is the lore of the reincarnated spite. It suggests that the ghost of the founder is now the god of the parasites. This represents the totalitarian sovereignty of the Leech King. The lore of the Queen Leech reveal is the lore of the dissolution of the human logic. When the man dissolves into a colossus of the slime, you realize that the identity is a liquid, proving that your sovereignty is the only solid reality. This highlights the cosmic horror of the infection, turning the control room into a sacrament of the retribution. The lore of the power station and the battery puzzles introduces the lore of the energetic skeleton of the Arkley. Throughout the plant, the need to restore the power and charge the batteries represents the mechanical sovereignty of the survival. The lore suggests that the darkness can only be defeated by the restoration of the light. This is the lore of the electrical resurrection. It suggests that the facility is a sleeping giant that requires the hero to wake it up for the destruction. This represents the technological sovereignty of the management. The lore of the battery is the lore of the spark of the hope. You must carry the weight to ignite the system, proving that your sovereignty is energetic. This highlights the methodical nature of the escape, turning the maintenance work into a sacrament of the agency, where the hero must power the end to save the beginning. The lore of the lurkers, the giant infected frogs, provides the lore of the amphibian predation of the shadow. These creatures, leaping from the murky water to swallow the unwary, represent the hidden danger of the stagnation. Their lore is defined by the sovereignty of the tongue. It suggests that the T-virus has infiltrated the food chain at every level, turning the swamp life into an ambush of the evolution, representing the biological sovereignty of the environment. This is the lore of the submerged terror. It suggests that safety is an illusion of the dry land. This represents the predatory sovereignty of the waste. The lore of the lurker attack is the lore of the sudden death. You must keep your distance from the water, proving that your sovereignty is aware. This highlights the paranoid nature of the Zero, turning the flooded hallway into a sacrament of the vigilance. The first phase of the Queen Leech battle provides the lore of the elasticity of the malice. As the Queen Leech grows into a vast, bulbous mass of the teeth and the tentacles, it represents the physical expansion of the grudge. The lore suggests that hatred is a weight that fills the room. This is the lore of the bloated sin. It suggests that the Marcus has become a whale of the infection. This represents the massive sovereignty of the progenitor. The lore of the first phase is the lore of the overwhelming presence. You must burn the flesh to find the heart, proving that your sovereignty is incendiary. This highlights the visceral nature of the conflict, turning the upper deck into a sacrament of the defiance, where the soldiers must stand their ground against the tide of the meat. For the Rebecca of the plant era, the world is the testing of the environmental resolve. You realize that the world is drowning in the sludge. The lore suggests that Rebecca is the clean breath in the methane. You are the only pair of eyes that sees the exit in a maze of the waste. The plant is not a building, it is a mechanical grave that you must seal with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the final duel so desperate. You are closing the book on the Arkley chapter. You look at the water, knowing that it is the only grave that the umbrella has left to hide the truth. The golden age is a hum of the generator, and you are the only frequency left to signal the end of the Marcus. As this fourth segment of the history concludes, the duo stands on the elevator to the surface, the plant groaning with the pressure of the self-destruction. Behind lies the excretory truth of the Empire. Before stands the final stand in the sunlight and the destruction of the Queen Leech. The air is no longer tense with the sewage, but charged with the electricity of the finale. You have seen the persistence of the faulty evolution, the metamorphosis of the vengeful memory, and the elasticity of the malice. The lore of Resident Evil has shifted from the sovereignty of the survival to the sovereignty of the purge. You realize that the sun is rising. You look at the weapon in your hand, knowing that you are finally the exterminator of the origin. The golden age is a siren blaring, and you are the only sound left to shatter the silence of the Resident Evil. The final stand against the Queen Leech and the frantic race to the surface introduces the lore of the solar purge of the primordial shadow. As the facility's self-destruction sequence counts down, the battle moves to the heliport level, where the darkness of the underworld meets the judgment of the dawn, representing the metaphysical boundary of the light. The lore suggests that the Queen Leech, having consumed the memories of the Marcus, is vulnerable to the natural radiation of the sun, which acts as a biological antiseptic against the ancient progenitor strain. For Rebecca and Billy, the battle is the lore of the dual sovereignty of the partner. One must distract the beast, while the other opens the roof, representing the synchronization of the survival. This is the lore of the vulnerability of the monarchy, where the queen is defeated not just by lead, but by the sanitizing force of the atmosphere. The final transformation of the Queen Leech provides the lore of the gross anatomical failure of the vengeance. In its desperate bid to survive the sunlight, the creature bloats into a colossal, amorphous mountain of the flesh, representing the hypermutagenic instability of the virus. Its lore is defined by the sovereignty of the mutation speed. It suggests that the T-virus can borrow the energy of the death to fuel its final growth, representing the chaotic sovereignty of the Leech King. This is the lore of the melting crown. Billy must shatter the shell with the magnum, while Rebecca mechanically exposes the core, proving that their sovereignty is tactical. This highlights the biological desperation of the Umbrella's father, turning the heliport into a sacrament of the extinction, where the god is boiled alive by the rising sun. The lore of the sunlight as the ultimate weapon provides the lore of the rejection of the ancient night. As the shutters of the facility open, the ultraviolet light causes the Queen Leech's cells to combust, representing the scientific sovereignty of the environment. The lore suggests that the progenitor virus was a flower of the shadow that cannot exist in the clarity of the day. This is the lore of the natural exorcism. It suggests that the world has its own immune system against the biohazard. This represents the cosmic sovereignty of the solar cycle. The lore of the burn is the lore of the final disinfection. You realize that the chemicals were just a delay, and only the universe can cure the Marcus, proving that your sovereignty was merely to hold the door open for the dawn. This highlights the elemental justice of the horror, turning the finale into a sacrament of the purification. The lore of the Arkley explosion and the erasure of the evidence provides the lore of the incendiary silence of the Umbrella. As the facility detonates, the fire consumes the leeches, the labs, and the bodies of the Bravo team, representing the pyrotechnic sovereignty of the cover-up. The lore suggests that Umbrella would rather burn a mountain than face a courtroom. This is the lore of the sterilized history. It suggests that the truth is a solid that can be turned into the smoke. This represents the corporate sovereignty of the oblivion. The lore of the explosion is the lore of the birth of the mystery. It reminds the player that the resident evil is just beginning, as the smoke from Zero drifts toward the mansion of the Spencer, proving that your sovereignty is the only unburnt record. This highlights the cynical gravity of the ending, turning the escape into a sacrament of the witness. The parting of Rebecca and Billy at the Forest Ridge provides the lore of the informal absolution of the criminal. Standing on the cliff overlooking the burning ruins, Rebecca takes Billy's dog tags, declaring him officially dead in her report, representing the moral sovereignty of the medic. The lore suggests that justice is a personal choice in a world of the lawless corporations. This is the lore of the covenant of the survivors. It suggests that the soldier is free only because the medic is a liar. This represents the humanitarian sovereignty of the truth. The lore of the dog tags is the lore of the ghost's freedom. Billy disappears into the greenery of the Arkley, proving that his sovereignty is anonymity, while Rebecca heads toward the mansion, proving that her sovereignty is duty. This highlights the bittersweet nature of the victory, turning the ending into a sacrament of the sacrifice. The lore of the Spencer Mansion silhouette introduces the lore of the imminent doom of the STARS. As Rebecca looks toward the distant Spencer Mansion, the lore suggests that the cycle of the infection is already waiting for the next victim, representing the interconnected sovereignty of the Arkley. This is the lore of the perpetual biohazard. It suggests that Zero was just the prologue of the agony. This represents the strategic sovereignty of the Wesker. The lore of the mansion view is the lore of the false morning. You realize that the sun has risen on the dead, but the house is still full of the shadows, proving that your sovereignty is exhausted. This highlights the grim continuity of the Resident Evil, turning the final scene into a sacrament of the bridge, where the Zero meets the One. For the Rebecca of the final part, the world is the testing of the narrative integrity. You realize that the world is burning to hide the sin. The lore suggests that Rebecca is the architect of the official lie. You are the only hand that erases the name of a good man to save his life. The heliport is not a platform. It is a pulpit of the judgment that you must uphold with your very soul. This perspective is what makes the filing of the report so heavy. You are becoming the hero by hiding the truth. You look at the smoking ruins, knowing that they are the only grave that the Marcus has left to haunt the future. The Golden Age is a dog tag in the pocket, and you are the only guardian left to walk toward the mansion of the damned. As this fifth segment of the history concludes, Rebecca stands at the forest ridge, the sun fully risen over the Arkley. Behind lies the solar purge of the shadow. Before stands the shadow of the Spencer mansion and the infinite nightmare of the Resident Evil. The air is no longer tense with the leech, but still with the fatigue of the survivor. You have seen the anatomical failure of the vengeance, the sunlight as the ultimate weapon, and the informal absolution of the criminal. The lore of Resident Evil has shifted from the sovereignty of the purge to the sovereignty of the legacy. You realize that the night is just beginning. You look at the mansion in the distance, knowing that you are finally the first link in the chain of the survival. The Golden Age is a dawn of the dead, and you are the only light left to carry the fire into the heart of the Umbrella. The post-game consequences and the immediate aftermath of the Arkley explosion introduces the lore of the containment of the radioactive secret. While the facility has been reduced to ash, the lore suggests that the information was the only thing Umbrella couldn't burn. For Rebecca, this period represents the erasure of the tactical history. She arrives at the Spencer mansion exhausted, yet forced into a new nightmare, proving that her victory was merely a shift in the combat theater. This is the lore of the sequential trauma, where the sovereignty of the hero is ground down by the infinite resources of the corporation. It proves that the Umbrella's strategy was to overload the witness, turning the forest of the Arkley into a sacrament of the endless night. The chronology of the Umbrella's fall provides the lore of the slow decay of the global monopoly. The data gathered from the Ecliptic Express and the training facility eventually reaches the underground markets, representing the information sovereignty of the whistleblower. The lore suggests that the Leech incident was the first crack in the pharmaceutical shield. This is the lore of the viral bankruptcy. It suggests that a company cannot survive the exposure of its founder's sins. This represents the economic sovereignty of the truth. The lore of the collapse is the lore of the falling Umbrella. It reminds the world that power built on the progenitor is a structure of the sand, turning the stock market crash into a sacrament of the retribution, where the board of directors becomes the cast of the fugitives. The future of Rebecca Chambers in the bioterrorist resistance provides the lore of the academic weaponization of the empathy. After the horrors of Zero and the mansion, Rebecca shifts from a field medic to a leading researcher for the BSAA, representing the intellectual evolution of the survivor. Her lore is defined by the sovereignty of the vaccine. She realizes that the only way to kill the virus is to understand its grammar, turning her medical degree into a sword of the science. This is the lore of the healing warrior. It suggests that heroism can be clinical. This represents the analytical sovereignty of the resistance. The lore of Rebecca's career is the lore of the living antithesis. She becomes the anti-Birkin, proving that her sovereignty is restorative. This highlights the productive nature of the trauma, turning the laboratory bench into a sacrament of the global health. The lore of the Billy Coen mystery provides the lore of the ghostly legend of the mercenary. After disappearing into the woods, Billy is never officially found by Umbrella or the government, representing the sovereignty of the total anonymity. The lore suggests that he became a phantom of the resistance, operating in the shadows of the civil wars, representing the vagabond sovereignty of the disgraced. This is the lore of the unrecorded valor. It suggests that the greatest heroes are the ones whose names are redacted. This represents the existential sovereignty of the exile. The lore of Billy's fate is the lore of the clean slate. It proves that the biohazard can wash away the past as effectively as it destroys the future, turning the military record into a sacrament of the blank page. The legacy of the James Marcus ghost provides the lore of the eternal haunting of the corporate ego. Even with his physical form destroyed, the Marcus doctrine of viral vengeance influences later bioterrorists like Alex Wesker and Glenn Arias, representing the philosophical sovereignty of the spite. The lore suggests that Marcus was the first to prove that the virus could have a vindictive personality. This is the lore of the intellectual infection. It suggests that the founder's hate is a genetic trait passed down to every BOW created by his formulas. This represents the ancestral sovereignty of the malice. The lore of the Marcus ghost is the lore of the warning of the creator. It reminds the new scientists that the creation will always eat the inventor, turning the history of virological research into a sacrament of the warning. The final assessment of the STARS Bravo team provides the lore of the expendable nature of the excellence. Looking back at the mission, the lore reveals that the team was chosen for their competence, so their death data would be more accurate, representing the cruel logic of the Umbrella's metrics. This is the lore of the optimized massacre. It suggests that Umbrella views human talent as a combustible fuel for their evolutionary engine. This represents the strategic sovereignty of the cold calculation. The lore of the Bravo team is the lore of the forgotten vanguard. It reminds the player that for every Chris Redfield, there are a dozen Edward DeWays and Kevin Dooleys who fed the virus with their lives, proving that your sovereignty is a debt to the fallen. This highlights the sorrowful foundation of the series, turning the Zero prequel into a sacrament of the mourning. For the Rebecca of the post-game era, the world is the testing of the long-term sanity. You realize that the world is permanently altered. The lore suggests that Rebecca is the librarian of the apocalypse. You are the only mind that connects the dots from the train to the global outbreaks. The resistance is not a job, it is a vigil that you must uphold with your very focus. This perspective is what makes the researching of the cures so solemn. You are fighting the ghost of Marcus in every petri dish. You look at the Arkley map, knowing that it is the only map that actually matters in the history of the human extinction. The Golden Age is a negative test result, and you are the only microscope left to watch the shadow of the Umbrella. As the sixth and final segment of the history concludes, the case of the Ecliptic Express is closed, but the war is open. Behind lies the genesis of the Zero. Before stands the global bioterrorism and the infinite mutation of the resident evil. The air is no longer tense with the mystery, but clear with the resolution of the resistance. You have seen the post-game consequences, the chronology of the fall, and the future of the Rebecca Chambers. The lore of Resident Evil has shifted from the sovereignty of the legacy to the sovereignty of the Eternal Watch. You realize that the Umbrella may be gone, but the virus is patient. You look at the laboratory horizon, knowing that you are finally the first physician of the end times. The Golden Age is a silent alarm, and you are the only hand left to seal the door against the bioorganic night.